Did you truly believe sending those children to the palace would save you?
It was never about saving me. It was about saving them from you.
The doors of Ashmoor Hall burst open before the footman could announce anyone at all. 3 children ran across the marble floor, their small shoes slapping against stone polished to a mirror shine, and 200 pairs of eyes turned at once. Crystal chandeliers trembled with the murmur that rippled through the ballroom. A string quartet faltered mid-note. Somewhere near the fountain of champagne, a glass shattered. The eldest, a boy no older than 7, skidded to a stop in front of the raised dais, where Duke Roland Ashworth stood beside his betrothed, Lady Cyrilda Cromwell, mid-toast, mid-smile, mid-everything a man built his whole life around. "Papa!" The word landed like a cannon shot in a room built for whispers. Roland's hand, raised with a crystal flute of champagne, did not move. His face, the face the entire kingdom called unreadable, carved from granite and old money and colder ambition, did not move either. But something behind his gray eyes cracked, quietly, the way ice cracks beneath weight. No one can see from the surface. "Papa, we found you," the boy said again, breathless, his cheeks flushed from running, from searching, from months, maybe years, of looking for a face he'd only ever seen in a single locket kept beneath a floorboard. Behind him, 2 younger children, a girl with dark curls and a boy barely old enough to walk steady, stumbled to a stop, clutching at each other's hands, staring up at the Duke with wide, uncertain eyes that searched his face for something they desperately needed to find. Lady Cyrilda's champagne flute slipped from her fingers. It did not shatter quietly. "Roland," her voice was thin ice over dark water. Who are these children?" The Duke said nothing. He could not. His eyes had already fallen, helplessly, the way a man falls when the ground disappears beneath him, to the eldest boy's face, the shape of the jaw, the particular tilt of the brow, the eyes storm gray, the exact shade his own mother's had been before illness took her 20 years ago. It was like looking into a mirror that remembered a version of himself he had buried. "Someone remove these children," Lord Cromwell barked from near the dais, his face purpling with the particular fury of a man watching his daughter's engagement combust in front of the entire nobility of the realm. "This is an outrageous scheme, no doubt, some peasant woman's attempt at—" "Don't touch them." The Duke's voice, when it finally came, was not loud. It didn't need to be. 2 decades of command lived inside those 2 words, and the guards who had started forward froze mid-step. Roland came down from the dais slowly, each step echoing through a ballroom gone utterly unnaturally silent. He knelt, the Duke of Ashmoor knelt, in front of nobility and foreign dignitaries, and the woman he was meant to marry within the month, and looked into the face of a boy who called him father. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. "Edmund," the boy said. "Like you told Mama to name me, if it was ever a boy." The Duke's breath left him like something torn loose. Behind him, Lady Cyrilda's voice had risen into something sharp and cracking, demanding answers, demanding explanations, demanding this humiliation be undone. But Roland heard none of it. He heard only the small, trembling voice of the girl beside Edmund, hardly 6 years old, whispering to her younger brother. "See, I told you he had grandmother's eyes." Somewhere in the crowd, a woman gasped a name Roland hadn't allowed himself to think in 7 years. Rosalind. And for the first time since the fire that had supposedly taken her from the world, Duke Roland Ashworth felt something inside his carefully built, carefully guarded chest come apart at the seams. 7 years is a long time to grieve a woman the world insists is dead. It is an even longer time to grieve a woman you were forbidden from loving in the first place. Roland had been 24 when he met Rosalind Verne. Not in a ballroom, not at some arranged introduction stitched together by desperate mothers and calculating fathers, but in the rain, on the road outside Ashmoor's eastern gate, where her carriage wheel had splintered against a stone and thrown her into the mud in a gown far too fine for a woman traveling without an escort. He had not known then that she was the disgraced daughter of a merchant house, crushed beneath scandal and debt. He had known only that she laughed, actually laughed, standing soaked and furious in the road, when most women would have wept. "You could help," she'd said, wiping mud from her cheek with the back of her hand, "instead of staring like I'm some curiosity you've never seen before." "I've never seen a woman laugh at her own ruin," he'd answered, and something in his chest had shifted, quiet and permanent, like the first stone settling into the foundation of something that would take years to finish building. He had not told her he was the Duke, not that first day, nor the second. when he found excuses to ride the same road. Not the third, when he brought a physician to tend the bruise on her ankle and let her believe he was merely a steward's son with more free time than sense. By the time she learned the truth, by the time the whole of society learned it, and the scandal broke over both their heads like the sky itself had turned against them, it no longer mattered what he was. She loved him. He loved her the way drowning men love air. Desperately, completely, without any interest in whether it was wise. His father, the old Duke, had called it madness. His council had called it ruin. Rosalind's own family, eager to climb back into favor through any means available, had called it an opportunity, until they discovered the old Duke would rather disown his son entirely than see him married beneath his station. And then, 3 months before Roland turned 25, the fire happened. Rosalind's family estate burned to cinders in the dead of night. 3 bodies recovered from the wreckage, charred beyond recognition, identified by a signet ring and a length of blue silk that matched a gown Roland himself had once seen her wear. He had not been permitted to see the bodies. His father had forbidden it, called it beneath his dignity to grieve a woman who was never meant to be his in the first place. Roland had mourned alone, in silence, in the particular agony of a man who has been told to feel nothing about the only thing he has ever truly felt everything about. He had built himself back into stone after that, cold, precise, unshakable. The kind of duke his father had always wanted, the kind of man who did not laugh in the rain, who did not chase carriages down muddy roads, who did not love anything more than duty. He had almost believed he'd succeeded, until 3 children walked into his engagement ball and called him father. "This is impossible," Lord Cromwell hissed. 3 hours later, in the Duke's private study, where the fire crackled low and the portraits of 6 generations of Ashworth Dukes watched the unraveling of the 7th with painted judgmental eyes. "The woman died 7 years ago. There were bodies. There was an inquest. This is clearly some fraud, some opportunist. Bring the children in," Roland said. His voice had none of the fire it should have carried. He was quiet in the particular way of a man standing at the edge of something enormous, unsure whether to step forward or fall. Serelda stood near the window, arms folded, her face a battlefield of fury and something that might have been fear. She had said little since the ballroom. That silence unsettled him more than her anger would have. The housekeeper, Mrs. Abington, brought the 3 children in herself, her weathered hands steady on their small shoulders, though her eyes betrayed her own shock. She had served the Ashworth family for 30 years. She had known Rosalind. She had wept, quietly, the week the fire took her. "Tell him your names," Mrs. Abington murmured gently to the children. "All 3, dear ones, just as you told me." The eldest boy straightened his small shoulders, some fragile courage stealing his spine. "I'm Edmund," he said again. "This is my sister Wren, and this is my brother, Cassius. He's only 3, he doesn't talk much yet." "And your mother," Roland said, his voice catching despite himself. "Where is she?" Something flickered across Edmund's young face. Grief too old for a child that age to carry, and something else beneath it. Fear. "She said if anything ever happened to her," Edmund said carefully, as though reciting words memorized through repetition, through nights of practice, through the particular discipline of a mother preparing her children for a truth she feared she might not live to explain herself. "We were to find the Duke of Ashmoor. We were to tell him our names. We were to tell him—" The boy hesitated. "Tell him what?" Roland's voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. "That she never stopped loving him," Edmund finished. Even when they told her she had to disappear, the fire cracked in the silence that followed. Lord Cromwell made a strangled sound of protest. Serelda's face had gone the color of old parchment. "Disappear," Roland repeated slowly, and something cold and furious began to coil in his chest, twisting around the grief that had lived there for 7 years, transforming it into something far more dangerous. Someone told her to disappear. "She's not dead," Wren said suddenly, her small voice fierce despite the tremble in it. "Everyone said she was, but she's not. She's just hiding, because of the man who hurt her." Roland went very still. "What man?" Wren's dark eyes, Rosalind's eyes, he realized now, the shape of them unmistakable. Filled with tears, she fought hard not to let fall. "The man who came to our house, the man Mama said we could never, ever talk about, not even to you." Duchess Dowager Ismelda Ashworth had not left her private wing of the palace in 4 years, not since the stroke that had stolen the strength from her left side and confined her to a chair by the window, where she spent her days watching the gardens change with seasons. she could no longer walk through. She had also, Roland knew, spent those years watching everything, hearing everything, forgetting nothing. He found her exactly where he expected, silhouetted against moonlight, her sharp eyes catching the firelight when he entered. "I heard the ballroom fell apart tonight," she said before he could speak. Her voice, though weakened by illness, still carried the particular authority of a woman who had once run half the kingdom's political affairs from behind her husband's throne. "Sit down, Roland. You look like a man who has seen a ghost walk and speak and call him father." "You knew," he said. It wasn't a question. Something in her stillness told him everything. "You knew she was alive." The old Duchess's jaw tightened, the only outward sign of the storm moving behind her composed face. "I knew what your father told me to know, and nothing more, for a very long time. Grandmother." The word came out rougher than he intended, edged with 7 years of grief he had never been permitted to express fully. "3 children walked into my engagement ball tonight and told me their mother is alive, that someone forced her into hiding, that there is a man they were forbidden to speak of, even to me. I need the truth, all of it, now." The Duchess was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting to the fire, to the flames that had once, 7 years ago, been reported to have consumed the only woman her grandson had ever truly loved. "Your father," she said finally, "was not the man you believed him to be." Roland's blood ran cold. "The fire," the Duchess continued, each word measured, deliberate, the confession of a woman who had carried this weight far too long, "was not an accident, and Rosalind Verne did not die in it." The room seemed to tilt beneath him. "Then who—" "I don't know the full truth," she said, and for the first time in Roland's memory, his grandmother's voice trembled. "Only fragments. Rumors your father silenced before they could take root. A payment made to a physician who falsified records. A carriage seen leaving the estate the night before the fire, carrying a woman matching her description, escorted by men in your father's livery." "You're telling me," Roland said, each word carved from stone, "that my own father staged her death, separated us, let me grieve for a woman he knew was alive." "I'm telling you," the Duchess said quietly, "that I believe he did far worse than that. And I believe, Roland, that whatever forced Rosalind into hiding all these years, whoever threatened her, whoever she was so terrified of that she gave up her children's father rather than risk his life, that danger has not gone away simply because 7 years have passed." Roland's hands curled into fists at his sides. "Where is she now?" The Duchess met his eyes, and in them he saw not just grief, but genuine fear. "That," she said softly, "is the question that may cost us everything to answer." Rain fell over the eastern district of the capital in thin gray sheets, blurring the lanterns lining the narrow streets far from the palace's golden avenues. Streets where a woman could disappear into the anonymity of ordinary lives, where a duchess in hiding could become simply another face in a crowd too poor and too tired to ask questions. Rosalind Verne stood at the window of a small rented room above a seamstress's shop, watching the rain, her arms wrapped tight around herself, though the cold in the room had little to do with the chill in her bones. The children had been gone for 3 hours. 3 hours had passed since she had watched Edmund square his small shoulders with a courage that broke her heart, since she had pressed a kiss to each of their foreheads and told them, voice shaking, that Mama needed them to be very brave, just this once, and go to the palace without her. 3 hours since she had made the most terrifying decision of her life, sending her children into the very world that had once tried to erase her from it entirely, trusting that Roland's love, if it still existed after 7 years of believing her dead, would be enough to protect them where she no longer could. Behind her, the door creaked. She turned, expecting the seamstress, expecting perhaps news, perhaps nothing at all. Instead, a shadow filled the doorway, tall, cloaked, unfamiliar, and entirely, dangerously wrong. "Hello, Rosalind," the voice said, low and pleasant in a way that made every instinct in her body scream. It's been a long time. Her heart stopped. She knew that voice. She had spent 7 years running from that voice. 7 years teaching her children to fear a name they were never allowed to speak. 7 years building a life from nothing rather than risk what this man had promised he would do if she ever tried to return to Roland Ashworth's side. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, backing toward the window, toward the door, toward anywhere that wasn't within reach of the man standing between her and freedom. "And yet," he said, stepping into the meager candlelight, revealing a face she had once trusted, once called family, now twisted with 7 years of patient, calculated cruelty. "Here we both are, Tell me, my dear, did you really think sending those children to the palace would save you? Rosalind's hand found the small knife she kept hidden in her skirts, the one habit of survival she had never allowed herself to abandon. It wasn't about saving me, she said, chin lifting despite the terror clawing at her throat. It was about saving them. From you. The man's smile did not waver. If anything, it sharpened. How touching, he said. Unfortunately for you, my dear Duchess, that should have been... It's far too late for that. Outside, thunder cracked over the capital, drowning the sound of Rosalind's scream beneath a storm that showed no sign of ending, while 3 miles away, in a palace study lit by dying firelight, Duke Roland Ashworth stared at a name his grandmother had just spoken aloud, a name from his father's most trusted circle, a name that turned his blood to ice. Because it was a name he had, until this very moment, called friend. Blades rose through the driving rain, and for one suspended heartbeat, Duke Roland Ashworth stood between the woman he loved and 4 armed men with nothing but 7 years of buried fury and a single sword between them and disaster. Then Ferris Halloway's company thundered into the alley's mouth, torches guttering against the storm, and the balance of the fight tipped as swiftly as it had threatened to collapse. Steel rang against steel. One of the hired men went down beneath Ferris's blade with a cry cut short. Another dropped his weapon and ran the moment he understood the odds had reversed against him, vanishing into the maze of narrow streets before anyone could give chase. Roland did not watch them scatter. His eyes had fixed on Ignatius Thorne, the man his father had called brother in all but blood for 30 years, the man who had bounced Roland on his knee as a child and toasted his 18th birthday and stood, solemn and dignified, at the old Duke's funeral 3 years past, and something in Roland's chest had gone perfectly, dangerously calm in the way that only comes after fury has burned past the point of shaking and settled into something colder and far more purposeful. You, Roland said again, sword leveled, rain running down the blade in silver threads. 30 years, Ignatius. 30 years I called you family. And I was family, Ignatius said, backing carefully toward the alley's far end, his earlier composure fraying at the edges now that the numbers had turned against him. Everything I did, Roland, I did to protect this family, protect it from a scandal that would have unmade everything your ancestors built across 6 generations, by murdering the woman I loved. Roland's voice cracked like a whip through the rain. By staging her death, stealing 7 years of my children's lives, threatening her with violence if she ever dared resurface. By preventing a catastrophe you were too blinded by infatuation to see coming. Ignatius snapped back, some of his own fury finally breaking through the careful mask he'd worn for 3 decades. Do you have any idea what would have happened if you'd married her, publicly, the way you intended? Do you understand what her bloodline actually carries? Roland went still. Beside him, soaked and shaking, Rosalind's breath caught audibly. What are you talking about? Roland demanded. Ignatius's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, the expression of a man who had spent 7 years believing himself justified, now finally given the chance to voice a truth he'd buried alongside a family's supposed deaths. Her grandmother, he said, was born Verne only after the family renounced a far older name, a name with a legitimate documented claim to the Ashworth dukedom itself, dating back 3 generations, through a marriage contract your own great-grandfather tried very hard to erase from every ledger and church record he could reach. Rosalind's bloodline isn't merely unsuitable for a duke's wife, Roland. It's a rival claim to everything you inherited. And that boy of yours, that son standing in your ballroom tonight, carries both bloodlines in a single body. Do you understand now? Do you finally understand what your father and I were protecting? The rain seemed to slow around them, each drop suspended in the horrible clarity of revelation. Rosalind's hand found Roland's arm, her fingers trembling. I didn't know, she said quietly, and the honesty in her voice was unmistakable, raw and unrehearsed. Roland, I swear to you I never knew any of this. My grandmother never spoke of it. I only knew we were poor and disgraced, and that no one would explain why our family had fallen so far from whatever we'd once been. She's telling the truth, Ignatius said, almost gently, almost regretfully, though his hand had drifted toward the blade still sheathed at his hip. Your father made certain of that. He paid handsomely to ensure the Verne family itself never learned what they carried. Easier to erase a threat that doesn't know it exists. Simpler for everyone, until she disappeared into hiding instead of dying properly. And now, 7 years later, that threat has grown into 3 small, living, breathing complications. Oh, share your face. Complications. Roland's voice had dropped to something dangerously quiet. Sword still leveled, fury coiling tighter with every word Ignatius spoke as though each syllable were fresh, kindling on a fire that had been smoldering for 7 long years. "You call my children complications." "I call them," Ignatius said. "Exactly what your father called them the night I helped him arrange Rosalind's disappearance. An inconvenience too dangerous to allow into the light. And I intend to finish what he started, whatever it costs me tonight." He lunged, not toward Roland, but toward Rosalind. A final desperate gambit from a cornered man with nothing left to lose. And Roland moved faster than thought. Faster than 7 years of careful, controlled grief had ever allowed him to move, driving his blade between Ignatius and the only woman he had ever loved with a fury that ended the confrontation in a single decisive motion. Ignatius crumpled against the cobblestones, wounded but alive, and Ferris's men closed around him before he could attempt another move, wrenching his arms behind his back, binding him with the rough efficiency of soldiers who had done this 100 times before in circumstances far less personal than this one. Roland did not watch them drag Ignatius away. He turned instead to Rosalind, rain streaming down both their faces, 7 years of separation and grief, an impossible longing collapsing into the narrow space between them, and for one long, suspended moment, neither of them spoke at all. "You came?" she whispered finally, disbelief and relief tangled together in her voice. "I never stopped looking," he said, though he hadn't known it was true until the words left him. Not really, not in 7 years. And then his arms were around her, and hers around him, and the storm raged on unnoticed around 2 people finding their way back to something they had both believed lost forever. Ferris approached them carefully, giving the reunion a respectful distance before duty demanded he interrupt it. "Your Grace," he said quietly, "Thorn is secured, though he took a nasty wound to the shoulder in the struggle. The physician traveling with us has stemmed the bleeding, but I'd recommend we move quickly, both to get him somewhere he can be properly held, and to get the lady and yourself out of this rain before either of you catches your death after everything else you've survived tonight." "Take him to the eastern garrison," Roland said, reluctantly releasing Rosalind, though his hand remained firmly at the small of her back, as though releasing her entirely might undo the fragile miracle of having found her at all. "Double the guard. I don't want a single man in that detail who has any prior connection to my father's household. I trust no one from that circle until I understand the full extent of what's been hidden from me." "Understood, Your Grace." Ferris hesitated, glancing toward Rosalind with an expression that mixed professional caution with something gentler, the particular respect of a soldier recognizing courage when he saw it plainly displayed. "My lady, for what it's worth, whatever you did to survive these 7 years, and to raise those 3 children safely through it, that took considerably more courage than anything I did in this alley tonight." Rosalind managed a tired, grateful smile, despite the exhaustion and adrenaline still coursing through her. "Thank you, Captain. Though I confess I've never felt less brave in my life than I did the moment that window latch nearly didn't give." "Brave people rarely feel it at the moment," Ferris said. "That's usually how you know it was real courage, rather than simple recklessness." The company escorted them from the alley into the last hours before dawn, torches guttering against a storm finally beginning to weaken. And Roland kept Rosalind close against his side the entire ride back toward the discreet inn he'd chosen over the palace itself, safer, for tonight. To keep her somewhere Cromwell's spies and whatever remained of Ignatius's network couldn't easily locate before morning brought clearer answers. The physician arrived within the hour to tend to a shallow cut along Rosalind's forearm and the bruises looming dark against her wrist where Ignatius's grip had bitten into her skin. And Roland refused to leave her side through any of it, standing sentinel at the edge of the small chamber he had commandeered at a discreet inn far from prying eyes, his presence a wall between her and whatever remained of the night's danger. "You don't need to hover," she told him once the physician had departed, a faint, tired smile tugging at the corner of her mouth, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her in 7 years, and it undid something carefully guarded in his chest all over again. "I do, actually," he said, settling into the chair beside her bed, without any apparent intention of moving from it. "I've spent 7 years believing you were dead, Rosalind. I intend to hover for a considerable while yet, if it's all the same to you." Her smile faltered, something more fragile moving beneath it. "I owe you 7 years of explanation," she said quietly. "I don't know where to begin." "Begin wherever it hurts least," he said gently, "and we'll work backward from there." She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers twisting in the blanket draped across her lap, and when she finally spoke, her voice had dropped to something raw and unguarded, the voice of a woman finally setting down a weight she'd carried alone for far too long. "Your father came to me himself," she said. "2 days before the fire. I was 7 months pregnant with Edmund, terrified, alone. My own family had already begun distancing themselves once the scandal broke, afraid of what association with a ruined woman might cost them. Your father sat across from me in my mother's parlor and told me, very calmly, that I had 2 choices. I could disappear quietly, with enough money to survive somewhere far from Ashmoor, and my child would grow up safe and unknown. Or I could stay, and fight, and watch him destroy everything and everyone I loved to ensure I never became your Duchess." Roland's jaw tightened, fury for a dead man burning fresh and useless in his chest. "I chose to fight, at first," Rosalind continued. "I told him I would go to you, tell you everything. Let you decide for yourself what risk you were willing to take. He laughed at that, told me you would choose duty over a pregnant merchant's daughter the moment the stakes were made clear to you. That love was a young man's luxury, easily abandoned once real consequence entered the equation." "He was wrong," Roland said, low and fierce. "I would have chosen you. I did choose you that very night in the garden before any of this happened. I know that now," she said softly. "I didn't know it then. I was frightened and alone, and carrying a child I couldn't protect on my own. And when the fire came 3 nights later, when I woke to smoke and screaming and your father's men pulling me from the house while 3 other bodies burned, in rooms meant to look like mine, I understood there was no more choosing left to do. Someone had already decided for me." "3 bodies," Roland said slowly, the detail catching, snagging against something in his memory. "Whose bodies, Rosalind? Who died in that fire in your place?" Something shifted in her expression, grief layered over confusion, an old wound she'd never fully been permitted to examine. "I was never told," she admitted. "Your father's men moved too quickly, gave me no time to ask questions, no time to grieve whoever those poor souls actually were. I've wondered for 7 years. I've never found an answer." Roland filed the detail away with grim, careful attention, another loose thread in a conspiracy that seemed to unravel further with every hour that passed, another mystery demanding an answer he did not yet possess. "What happened after?" he asked instead, gentling his voice, watching her face for the particular flinches that told him where the deepest wounds still lived. "I ran," she said simply, "as far as the money your father gave me could carry me, until I found a small village where no one asked questions about a widow with a swelling belly and no husband to speak of. Edmund was born there. Wren, 2 years later, after I'd finally found steady work as a seamstress and dared to believe we might build some small, quiet life together. Cassius came a year after that." Her voice caught, just slightly. "I told myself it was enough. I told myself safety mattered more than truth, more than love, more than anything else I'd once believed I couldn't live without." "Was it enough?" Roland asked gently. She was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with visible honesty rather than reaching for a comfortable answer. "Some days," she said finally, "some days I watched them laugh, watched them grow, watched Edmund learn to read by candlelight because he wanted so badly to write letters to a father he'd never met, and I told myself I had built something worth the cost. Other nights, I lay awake calculating exactly how much longer our savings would last, or startled awake at every unfamiliar footstep on the road outside, certain your father's men, or worse, had finally found us. There was an autumn when Wren was still an infant, when a fever took hold of the village and I sat beside her cradle for 3 nights straight, absolutely certain I would lose her, absolutely certain there was no one in the entire world I could call for help without risking everything I'd sacrificed to protect her. I have never felt more alone in my life than I did those 3 nights. I would have come," Roland said, voice rough with an old, useless grief. "If I had known, if there had been any way to reach me. I know that now," she said softly. "I didn't allow myself to believe it then. Your father had been very thorough in convincing me that reaching out would only bring danger crashing down on all of us. I chose isolation because I believed, with everything in me, that isolation was the only thing keeping my children alive." "And Ignatius?" Roland asked. "When did he find you?" 3 years ago. Her hands had gone very still in her lap. "He found the village somehow. I still don't know how exactly, and made it very clear that your father's death hadn't ended the arrangement, that the family's fortune, and his own considerable investment in ensuring my silence depended on my continued disappearance. He threatened the children directly. Roland told me precisely what would happen to Edmund if I ever tried to return. I believed him. I had no reason not to. What changed? Roland asked quietly. Why send them to me now, after 3 years of that threat hanging over you? Rosalind's eyes met his, steady despite the exhaustion and fear still etched into her face. Because Edmund turned 7 last month, she said, and he asked me, for the first time, whether his father was a good man. And I realized I had spent 3 years teaching my children to fear a truth I should have trusted them, to survive facing together. I decided I would rather risk everything than let my son grow up believing his father was someone worth hiding from. Roland reached for her hand then, slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished, and when she didn't, when her fingers curled into his with the same instinctive trust she'd shown him on a muddy road 7 years and a lifetime ago, something in his chest that had been frozen since the night of the fire finally, fully began to thaw. You will never have to hide again, he said. Not from me, not from anyone, I swear it. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The space between them, charged with 7 years of longing, finally permitted to surface without fear of consequence. Roland's gaze dropped, briefly, unmistakably, to her mouth, and he watched color rise in her cheeks as she noticed exactly where his attention had settled. Roland, she said, his name barely more than breath, equal parts warning and invitation. I know, he said, not moving away, not moving closer either, holding himself with visible effort at the careful edge of restraint. It's too soon. There's too much unresolved. Ignatius, the document, whatever comes next. I have no wish to rush you into anything before you're ready, Rosalind. Not after everything you've survived alone. That isn't what I was going to say, she admitted, something almost shy moving across her tired, beautiful face, an expression he remembered achingly well from the earliest days of their courtship, before scandal and grief had ever touched either of them. I was going to say that 7 years is already far too long to have waited for this. I find myself considerably less interested in waiting any longer than duty or caution strictly demand. Something fierce and tender moved through his chest at her words, and he reached up, slowly, to brush a stray curl from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek with a tenderness that belied the danger and exhaustion of the night behind them. Then let it simply be understood between us, he murmured, that whatever comes next, however long we're forced to wait for safety before we can properly claim it. This is not a question either of us needs to keep asking. I love you, Rosalind Verne. I have never stopped, and I never will. She closed the last small distance herself this time, rising onto her toes to press the lightest, gentlest kiss against the corner of his mouth, restrained, careful, a promise rather than its fulfillment, before drawing back with a small, breathless laugh that carried 7 years of relief within it. Not yet, she said softly, answering the question neither of them had spoken aloud. But soon, Roland, I promise you that much. The children were asleep by the time Roland brought Rosalind back to Ashmoor Hall in the gray hour before dawn, tucked into a guest chamber adjoining his own private wing under Mrs. Abington's watchful care. And the reunion, when it came, was quiet in the way that only the deepest relief ever truly is. Rosalind stood in the doorway for a long moment, simply watching them breathe. Edmund curled protectively around his younger siblings even in sleep, and Roland watched her watch them, understanding for the first time the full weight of what she had sacrificed to keep them safe alone for 7 impossible years. They're beautiful, he said softly, coming to stand beside her. They're exhausted, she said, though her voice carried a warmth that undercut the practical observation entirely. As am I, if I'm honest. Then rest, he said. All of you. Whatever comes next, whatever Ignatius reveals, whatever my father built and hid, whatever remains of Cromwell's schemes, none of it needs solving before the sun rises. Tonight, you're simply safe. That's the only thing that matters. She turned to look at him then, and something passed between them that neither of them fully named aloud. 7 years of grief and longing and impossible hope, distilled into a single, unguarded glance across a dim hallway lit by the first gray light of dawn. Thank you, she said quietly, for not giving up on us, even when you believed we were gone. I never stopped grieving you, he admitted. I simply forgot. Somewhere along the way, that grief and hope could occupy the same heart at once. She reached up then, slowly, and pressed her palm flat against his chest, over the place where his heart beat too hard whenever she was near. The same gesture she'd made in the garden 7 years ago, the same words unspoken between them now as they had been then. "I never stopped either," she whispered. Neither of them moved to close the last small distance between them. Not yet, not with exhaustion and danger, and 7 years of complicated grief still heavy in the air around them. But something had shifted irrevocably in that dim hallway, some old promise finally, quietly renewing itself after 7 years of enforced silence. Wren stirred sometime past midday, blinking sleep-heavy eyes at the unfamiliar grandeur of the chamber around her, before her gaze found her mother standing in the doorway. And the small girl was across the room in an instant, throwing herself into Rosalind's arms with the particular desperate relief of a child who had spent hours fearing something terrible had happened while she slept. "Mama, you came. I told Edmund you'd come. I told him, I'm here, my love." Rosalind gathered her close, pressing a kiss into her dark curls, and Roland watched the reunion with an ache in his chest that had nothing to do with grief, and everything to do with a happiness he'd nearly forgotten himself capable of feeling. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere ever again." Edmund woke moments later, more reserved in his relief than his younger sister, but no less profound in his own quiet way, crossing the room to stand at his mother's side with the careful dignity of a boy who had shouldered too much responsibility too young and wasn't quite ready to fully release it, even now. "Is it over?" he asked, looking between his mother and the Duke with the particular gravity of a child who understood, better than most adults gave him credit for, that danger rarely resolved as simply as storybooks promised. Roland knelt to meet the boy's eyes directly, understanding instinctively that Edmund deserved honesty rather than comforting evasion. "Not entirely," he admitted. "But you are safe, Edmund, and your mother is safe, and I intend to spend whatever time it takes ensuring that safety becomes permanent rather than temporary. That is a promise, not simply a comfort." Edmund studied him for a long moment, something in his young face weighing the words with the particular seriousness of a boy who had learned, far too early, that adults did not always keep their promises. Then, slowly, he nodded, and something in his rigid posture finally eased. "Mama says you kept your promises before," he said quietly, "even when you didn't know we existed to make them too." "I intend to keep making them," Roland said, "for as long as you'll let me." Cassius, roused by the sound of voices, toddled across the room on unsteady legs and simply attached himself to Roland's leg with the uncomplicated trust of a very young child, and Roland found himself lifting the boy into his arms without conscious decision, some deep, instinctive paternal reflex overriding 7 years of careful, guarded distance from any emotion this large and unguarded. "He likes you," Rosalind observed, something soft and wandering in her voice, as she watched Cassius settle comfortably against Roland's shoulder, a small fist curling into the fabric of his coat. "The feeling," Roland said, throat unexpectedly tight, "is entirely mutual." Lord Cromwell arrived at Ashmoor Hall shortly after 10 that morning, uninvited and visibly furious, demanding an immediate audience that Roland, exhausted and heartsore and entirely unwilling to indulge political theater after the night he'd survived, granted with considerably less patience than protocol demanded. "I understand Ignatius Thorne has been taken into custody," Cromwell said without preamble, pacing the length of the study with barely contained agitation. "I understand there are accusations being leveled against your late father's memory, against long-settled arrangements that have served this family well for decades. I must insist, Your Grace, that this matter be handled with considerably more discretion than you displayed last night, unless you intend to see the Ashworth name dragged through scandal for a generation." "The Ashworth name," Roland said coldly, "has apparently been built, in part, on the theft of another family's rightful claim and the murder of innocents to conceal it. Forgive me if I find your concern for discretion somewhat misplaced this morning." Cromwell's face paled, then flushed, a man caught precisely between denial and the particular panic of someone watching carefully buried secrets claw their way toward daylight. "You cannot possibly believe Ignatius's ravings constitute proof of anything," he said, though his voice had lost the commanding certainty it usually carried. The man was cornered, desperate, willing to say anything to shift blame away from himself. "Then explain your own silence when I asked you directly last night how long you'd known Rosalind Verne was alive," Roland said, rising from behind his desk, crossing the room with slow, deliberate steps that made Cromwell retreat half a pace despite himself. Explain the alliance between your family and mine that began forming a full year before Cyrilda was ever introduced to me. An alliance built, perhaps, on very particular knowledge of exactly what my father had done and precisely what silence was worth to men like you and Ignatius Thorne. Cromwell's composure finally cracked entirely, fury and fear tangling together into something almost pitiable. You understand nothing of the complexities involved, he snapped. Your father came to me, not the reverse. Desperate for allies who could help contain a scandal that threatened to unmake 3 generations of careful political maneuvering. I did what any sensible man would do in my position. I secured my family's future by aligning with power rather than opposing it. By helping bury a woman alive, Roland said, voice dropping to something dangerously quiet, and stealing 7 years from 3 innocent children. I did nothing of the sort, Cromwell insisted, though the protest rang hollow even to his own ears, judging by the way his voice wavered around the lie. I merely declined to ask questions whose answers I had no wish to know. There is a considerable difference, Your Grace, between complicity and simple, practical discretion. Is there? Roland asked softly. I confess I struggle to see it. Cromwell's hands, Roland noticed, had begun to tremble slightly despite the man's evident effort to maintain his composure. The particular tremor of a man watching decades of careful positioning collapse in real time. What do you intend to do? Cromwell asked finally, and for the first time genuine fear had crept fully into his voice, stripped of its usual bluster. Will you drag my family's name through the same scandal you're now determined to expose about your own? That depends entirely on you, Roland said, and on how forthcoming you're willing to be regarding everything you know about Ignatius Thorne's activities over the past 7 years. I have no particular interest in destroying Cyrilda's future. She has done nothing to deserve that, and I intend to see her protected from the worst of whatever fallout follows. You, however, find yourself considerably less inclined to protect. I can offer information, Cromwell said quickly, pride visibly warring with self-preservation and losing badly. Ignatius kept records, meticulous ones, the sort of man who documents everything as insurance against exactly this circumstance. I don't know where he keeps them now, but I know he maintained a private residence outside the city limits, unregistered under his own name, that your father's household accounts once quietly financed. Where? Roland demanded. I can have the location for you by evening, Cromwell said, some fragment of his old composure returning now that he had leverage to offer rather than simply guilt to confess. In exchange for my family's name remaining, shall we say, adjacent to this scandal rather than at its center. Roland considered him for a long moment, weighing the value of the information against his own considerable contempt for the man offering it. Bring me that location by evening, he said finally, and we'll discuss what remains of your family's reputation afterward. Fail to deliver, and I promise you, Cromwell, I will personally ensure every drawing room in the capital knows precisely what role you played in burying a woman alive. Cromwell departed considerably faster than he'd arrived, blustering threats about political consequence that carried considerably less weight than they might have 24 hours earlier, and Roland watched him go with the grim satisfaction of a man who had just turned one conspirator's fear into a useful weapon against the rest. Whatever alliance had protected this conspiracy for 7 years was unraveling now. Thread by thread, and men like Cromwell, men who had built their fortunes on careful complicity, had every reason to fear what daylight might finally reveal. The Duchess Dowager received the full account of the previous night's events with a stillness that Roland had come to recognize, over the years, as the particular calm of a woman absorbing devastating information and calculating its consequences before permitting herself any visible reaction at all. A rival claim to the dukedom itself, she repeated slowly, once he'd finished. Through your great-grandfather's marriage contract, I had heard rumors of such a thing once, decades ago, dismissed as little more than idle gossip among the older families. I never imagined it carried any real substance. Ignatius seemed to believe it carried a great deal of substance, Roland said grimly. Enough substance to justify murder, in his estimation, and my father's as well. Then we must find the original documents, his grandmother said, some of her old political sharpness returning to her weakened voice, despite the late hour and the shock of the revelation. If such a contract exists, if Rosalind's bloodline genuinely carries a legitimate claim, then whoever controls that document controls a considerable weapon, Roland. In the wrong hands, it could be used to challenge Edmund's own legitimacy someday, or worse, to challenge yours. Ignatius will know where it's kept, Roland said, assuming he survives long enough to answer for what he's done. And assuming he's willing to answer at all, the Duchess said. Men like Ignatius Thorne do not spend 30 years constructing an elaborate deception only to surrender the truth easily once cornered. He will bargain, Roland. He will look for whatever leverage remains to him, and I suspect you already understand precisely what that leverage might be. Roland's blood ran cold at the implication, understanding arriving a half-second before his grandmother spoke the words aloud. "The children," he said. "The children," she confirmed grimly, "and the woman who bore them." Ignatius has already demonstrated a willingness to threaten violence against both. I would not assume custody and a prison cell have tempered that particular inclination, especially if he believes exposure means the complete ruin of everything he's spent 30 years protecting. Roland was quiet for a long moment, turning over a detail Rosalind had confided in him during their long conversation at the inn. A detail that had lodged itself uncomfortably in his mind ever since. "Grandmother," he said slowly, "when the fire happened, 3 bodies were recovered from the estate. Rosalind was never told whose bodies they were. Do you know?" Something shifted behind the Duchess's composed expression. A flicker of old, buried unease she had clearly not expected to revisit tonight. "I remember your father mentioning once, in a moment of rare, unguarded weakness, that the arrangement had cost more lives than he'd anticipated," she said carefully. "I assumed at the time he meant simply the moral cost of the deception. I wonder now whether he meant something considerably more literal." "You think he had people killed," Roland said, "specifically to provide bodies for the inquest." "I think," his grandmother said, each word measured with visible reluctance, "that a man capable of staging a woman's death and stealing 7 years from her children was very likely capable of considerably worse, if the stakes demanded it. I did not want to believe it before tonight. I find I can no longer afford the luxury of that particular denial." The weight of the revelations settled over the room like a shroud. Somewhere beneath the immediate danger to Rosalind and the children, Roland understood, an even darker truth waited to be uncovered. The identities of whoever had died to make his father's lie convincing, and whatever debt of justice their families were still owed. "We will find out," Roland said quietly, as much a vow to himself as a statement to his grandmother. "All of it, whatever it costs, whatever it reveals about my own father's legacy. I will not build my children's future on a foundation of buried victims and unanswered questions." "Good," the Duchess said, something like pride flickering through her exhaustion. "That is precisely the kind of duke your mother always hoped you'd become, Roland, not the one your father tried to make you." That evening, Roland found Rosalind in the estate's private garden, the same garden his own mother had once tended before illness took her, wandering slowly among rose bushes, just beginning to bud with the first green promise of spring. She had changed into a simple gown Mrs. Abington had provided, her dark hair loose around her shoulders in a way that struck him, suddenly and forcefully, with how young she still looked despite everything the last 7 years had cost her. "The children are settling in well," she said without turning, though something in her voice told him she'd sensed his approach long before he'd spoken. "Wren has already charmed the entire kitchen staff into extra sweets. Edmund keeps asking Ferris to teach him swordplay. Cassius simply seems delighted to have discovered stairs he's finally tall enough to climb without assistance. They're remarkable children," Roland said, coming to stand beside her among the roses. "You raised them remarkably, given everything you faced alone." "I had help, eventually," she admitted. "A kind widow in the village who never asked the questions she clearly wanted to ask. A physician who treated us without payment more than once, simply because he pitied a young mother raising 3 children alone. Small kindnesses, here and there, that made the impossible merely difficult instead." "I intend to spend considerable time," Roland said quietly, "making up for every kindness I wasn't there to offer." She turned to look at him then, something vulnerable and searching in her expression. "Roland, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly, whatever the truth costs either of us." "Anything," he said. "If this rival claim is real," she said slowly, "if my bloodline genuinely threatens your inheritance, your title, everything your family has built across 6 generations, what happens to us? To the children? I have spent 7 years terrified of being a danger to the people I love. I find I am no less terrified of it now, even standing here in your garden, even after everything we survived last night." Roland considered the question with the gravity it deserved, understanding that his answer, however he framed it, would shape whatever came next between them. "I don't care what any old contract claims," he said finally. "I am the Duke of Ashmoor. Whatever inheritance I hold it because I choose to honor the responsibilities that come with it, not because some ancient document grants me permission to love the people I choose to love. If Edmund's claim is legitimate, we will face that truth together, honestly, rather than burying it the way my father buried you. But nothing about that truth changes what I feel for you, Rosalind. Nothing ever could." Something in her face broke open then, relief and hope, and 7 years of carefully guarded fear finally beginning to release its grip. And when he reached for her this time, she did not hesitate, closing the last small distance between them until her forehead rested against his chest, his arms wrapped fully around her for the first time in 7 long years. "I love you," he murmured against her hair. "I have never once stopped, not for a single day of the 7 years I believed you gone." "I love you too," she whispered back, "more than I ever let myself admit, even in the darkest, loneliest nights of hiding." For one perfect, suspended moment, standing among roses just beginning to bloom, the danger and conspiracy and 7 years of grief seemed to recede into something survivable, something they might finally face together instead of apart. 2 days earlier, before the confrontation with Ferris in the garden, Roland had insisted on introducing Rosalind formally to the small circle of trusted household staff and allied nobility, who could be relied upon for discretion, and it was there, in the more intimate of the estate's receiving rooms, that Roland first felt the unfamiliar, unwelcome heat of jealousy stir in his chest since Rosalind's return. Lord Percival Ashby, a widower with considerable charm and an estate bordering Ashmoor's northern boundary, had arrived under the guise of offering condolences regarding the broken engagement, though his attention had settled almost immediately on Rosalind with an interest that had nothing whatsoever to do with sympathy for Roland's circumstances. "Miss Verne," Ashby had said, bowing over her hand with rather more ceremony than the introduction strictly required, "if I may say, the resilience required to survive what you've survived and still carry yourself with such grace. It's remarkable, truly remarkable." "You're too kind, my lord," Rosalind had replied, polite but faintly bemused by the attention, entirely unaware of the way Roland's jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly from across the room. "Not kindness," Ashby had continued, clearly encouraged. "Simple honesty. I confess I find myself curious what plans you might have, now that you've returned to society. A woman of your evident strength and character shouldn't remain unattached for long, whatever the Duke ultimately decides regarding arrangements." Roland had crossed the room before he'd fully registered his own intention to move, inserting himself into the conversation with a directness that bordered on impolite. "Miss Verne's plans," he said, "involve remaining precisely where she belongs, with her children, and with me, for as long as she'll have us. I trust that answers whatever curiosity you were harboring, Ashby." Ashby had blinked, clearly startled by the uncharacteristic bluntness from a man renowned throughout the peerage for icy, unshakable composure. "Of course, Your Grace. I meant no presumption." "None taken," Roland had said, though his tone suggested otherwise, and he had not left Rosalind's side for the remainder of the visit, his hand finding the small of her back with a possessiveness he made no particular effort to disguise. "You didn't need to do that," Rosalind told him later, once Ashby had departed, though her voice carried an unmistakable note of amusement rather than reproach. The same pleasure, he suspected, she'd felt watching him stake his claim against Viscount Pelham 7 years earlier. "I'm aware," Roland admitted, unrepentant. "I found I wanted to anyway. Some habits, apparently, 7 years cannot fully break." "Good," she'd said simply, threading her fingers through his without hesitation, "because I find I rather enjoyed watching you do it." Back in the present, standing among the roses with her forehead still resting against his chest, Roland allowed himself one more moment of unguarded peace before the world inevitably intruded again. And it did, sooner than either of them would have liked, when Ferris burst into the garden, breathless and grim-faced, urgency written plainly across every line of his expression. "Your Grace." His voice carried the particular weight of a man bearing news he wished he didn't have to deliver. "Ignatius Thorne has escaped custody, and he's taken something with him, a document from the estate archive, retrieved before anyone realized he'd slipped free. We believe it's the marriage contract itself." Roland felt Rosalind go rigid against him, felt his own heart plummet at the implication. "Where is he now?" Roland demanded. "We don't know," Ferris admitted grimly. "But, Your Grace, there's more. A messenger arrived not 10 minutes ago, claiming to carry word from Thorne directly. He says he'll surrender the document and disappear from all of your lives permanently, in exchange for one thing only. What thing? Roland asked, though some cold, prescient part of him had already guessed the answer before Ferris spoke it aloud. The boy, Ferris said quietly. Edmund. Thorne says if you want the proof of his crimes destroyed and your children's legitimacy protected forever, you're to bring the boy to him alone, by midnight tomorrow, or he'll take that document straight to the crown himself and let the entire kingdom decide whether Edmund Ashworth is a beloved heir or a dangerous rival claim worth eliminating. The Rose Garden, so recently a sanctuary of quiet hope, felt suddenly unbearably cold, and Roland understood, with the particular clarity that only true danger ever brings, that the fight for his family's future had only just begun. He wants to trade my son, Roland said slowly, for a document that could destroy him just as thoroughly as it might destroy us. He's desperate, Your Grace, Ferris said. Wounded, hunted, with nowhere left to run and no allies willing to shelter him now that his crimes are exposed. Desperate men make desperate offers, and desperate threats. You cannot possibly consider it, Rosalind said, her voice sharp with a fear so absolute it had burned straight through the exhaustion still etched into her face. Roland, I have spent 7 years protecting that boy from exactly this man. I will not stand here and watch you hand him over, not even for one night, not even under the heaviest guard you could possibly provide. I have no intention of handing Edmund over to anyone, Roland said firmly, drawing her close again, though his mind had already begun working through the tangle of possibilities Ferris's news had opened before him. But I also cannot simply ignore the threat. If Ignatius truly possesses that document, and truly intends to bring it before the crown, the danger doesn't end with tonight's refusal. It simply shifts into a courtroom, or worse, into whatever desperate violence a cornered man decides is his only remaining option. Then what do we do? Rosalind asked, and for the first time since her return, Roland heard something genuinely uncertain in her voice. Not the careful composure of a woman who had spent 7 years surviving impossible odds alone, but the raw fear of a mother facing a threat she could no longer face by herself. We do exactly what Ignatius doesn't expect, Roland said, something cold and determined settling into his expression. The particular calm of a man who had spent years commanding soldiers through far bloodier confrontations than this one. We give him a trap disguised as a surrender, and we ensure that whatever happens at midnight tomorrow, it is the last desperate act of a man with nothing left to threaten us with ever again. Ferris nodded slowly, already turning over the tactical possibilities in his mind. It won't be simple, Your Grace. Ignatius knows this family's resources better than almost anyone alive. He'll expect deception. Then we'll simply have to outthink a man who spent 30 years believing himself the cleverest person in every room he entered, Roland said grimly. Gather everyone we trust completely, Ferris. Tonight, we plan. Tomorrow, we end this, one way or another. Ferris hesitated a moment longer at the garden's edge, something troubled still visible in his expression despite his obvious eagerness to begin preparations. Your Grace, there's one more consideration. If Cromwell delivers the location of Thorne's private residence as promised, we may have the opportunity to act before midnight even arrives, to locate the document ourselves, rather than risk the exchange at all. Do it, Roland said immediately. Send a discreet party the moment Cromwell's information arrives. If we can recover that document without ever placing Edmund within 100 miles of Ignatius Thorne, I will consider tonight's danger the smallest price we've had to pay in this entire affair. And if the residence is guarded, if Thorne anticipated exactly this response, then we adjust, Roland said, the same way we adjusted tonight, when 4 armed men thought they held every advantage over an unarmed woman in an empty room. Ignatius has spent 30 years believing patience and secrecy made him untouchable. He has forgotten, I think, precisely how dangerous a cornered man becomes once someone finally forces his hand into the light. Rosalind watched the exchange with quiet, fierce attention, understanding of the stakes visible in every line of her exhausted, resolute face. Whatever happens tomorrow, she said, I want to be there. Not hidden away in some safe room while others decide my children's fate. I have spent 7 years making impossible choices alone in the dark. I refuse to be excluded from this one, however dangerous it proves to be. Roland studied her for a long moment, weighing his own instinctive urge to shield her from further danger against the plain. undeniable truth that she had survived far worse than tomorrow was likely to demand, entirely alone, for 7 consecutive years. "Then you'll be there," he said finally. "At my side, exactly where you belong." Rosalind's hand found his in the fading evening light, her grip fierce with a resolve that matched his own. "Whatever the plan is," she said quietly, "I intend to be part of it. I have hidden long enough, Roland. I will not hide from this." He looked at her then, this woman who had survived 7 years of impossible danger alone, who had raised 3 remarkable children in secret, who had risked everything to bring them back into his life, despite every threat hanging over her, and understood, with fierce and absolute certainty, that whatever waited for them at midnight tomorrow, they would face it exactly as she'd insisted, together. If Roland and Rosalind's fight to reclaim their family has kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to like this video and drop a comment below. Do you think Ignatius Thorne is bluffing, or does he truly hold proof that could unravel everything the Ashworth dukedom stands on? Stay with us. The final battle for their family is only just beginning. Cromwell's information arrived precisely as promised, delivered by a nervous messenger just before sunset. A modest hunting lodge 2 hours' ride north of the capital, registered under a false name but paid for. According to the estate ledgers, Cromwell had finally surrendered in full, from an account Roland's father had quietly maintained, for exactly this sort of discreet arrangement. Roland led the raiding party himself, Ferris at his side, a dozen of his most trusted men riding hard through the falling dark toward whatever answers waited behind the lodge's shuttered windows. They found it dark and seemingly abandoned when they arrived. The front door unlocked in a manner that struck Roland immediately as deliberate, rather than careless. The particular carelessness of a man who wanted pursuers to believe they'd caught him unprepared. "Careful," Roland murmured to his men as they fanned through the modest rooms, torches casting long, uncertain shadows across dust-covered furniture. "This has the shape of a trap dressed as an oversight." They found no trap, in the end, only evidence, a locked study at the rear of the lodge, its door splintered open under Ferris's boot, revealing shelves of meticulously organized ledgers and correspondence that told, in Ignatius Thorne's own careful hand, the full and damning story of everything he and the old Duke had built together across 3 decades of careful conspiracy. Roland worked through the documents with grim, methodical attention, Ferris holding a lantern steady beside him as the truth unfolded page by page. Payments to a physician named Corwin Hale, dated 3 days before the fire. A separate ledger entry, in the same hand, recording a considerably larger sum paid to the same physician 4 days after. The second payment, Roland realized with cold, dawning horror, almost certainly purchasing the man's permanent silence regarding whatever role he'd played in providing the fire's 3 unidentified victims. "Paupers," Ferris said quietly, reading over Roland's shoulder, his own expression darkening with the same grim understanding. "Look here, Your Grace, payments to the workhouse overseer, dated the same week. 3 unclaimed bodies, released without question in exchange for coin." The revelation settled over Roland like a physical weight, the particular horror of understanding that 3 nameless, forgotten souls had been stolen even in death, used as props in a conspiracy that had cost them whatever dignity even poverty hadn't already claimed. "We will find their families," Roland said quietly, fury and grief tangled together in his voice. "If any remain to be found, they deserve proper burial. They deserve their names spoken, at the very least, after everything that was stolen from them to build this lie." Ferris continued working through the remaining shelves as Roland absorbed the weight of what they'd uncovered. And it was Ferris who found the final piece of the puzzle, a slim, separate ledger tucked behind a false panel at the rear of the desk, its pages filled with a different hand entirely, more hurried, less composed than Ignatius's careful documentation. "Your Grace," Ferris said, something careful in his voice as he passed the volume across. "You should see this." Roland realized as he read, Corwin Hale's private account of the arrangement, written, it seemed, as a kind of insurance against exactly the betrayal he'd apparently feared from his co-conspirators. The entries painted a portrait of a man who had convinced himself, at first, that he was simply providing an act of mercy to unclaimed paupers who would otherwise receive no burial at all, before the full weight of what he'd participated in seemed to have broken something in him. The final entry, dated some 4 years past, recorded his own growing terror that Ignatius intended to silence him permanently, rather than risk his conscience finally overwhelming his complicity. "He disappeared not long after," Ferris said grimly, having clearly reached the same entries. I recall hearing of it at the time. A respected physician vanishing without explanation, presumed to have simply abandoned his practice for reasons unknown. No one thought to connect it to anything more sinister. Ignatius murdered him, Roland said, the pieces settling into place with grim, inevitable clarity. To ensure his silence permanently, the same way he tried to ensure Rosalind's silence with threats against our children. There's an address here, Ferris said, turning back several pages. A burial site, it seems, noted in the physician's own hand before his final entry, as though he suspected what was coming and left some record behind, hoping someone might eventually find it. Roland closed the ledger slowly, understanding that whatever justice tonight's raid delivered, it would need to extend considerably further than simply recovering a single contested document. We'll recover what remains there too, he said. Whatever bones this conspiracy left buried, I intend to see every one of them properly named and properly mourned before this is finished. Beneath the ledgers, wrapped carefully in oilcloth at the bottom of a locked drawer, they found it, the marriage contract itself, 3 generations old, its ink faded but its seal unmistakably authentic, documenting precisely what Ignatius had claimed. A legitimate, if long-buried claim connecting Rosalind's bloodline to the Ashworth dukedom through a marriage her own great-great-grandmother had made, and Roland's great-grandfather had spent considerable effort erasing from official memory. Roland held the document for a long moment, understanding its weight in ways that went far beyond ink and old vellum. What will you do with it? Ferris asked quietly. The truth, Roland said, regardless of what it costs. I built my entire adult identity in reaction to my father's lies. I will not begin my own legacy by burying another one. Midnight arrived cold and clear, the storm of the previous nights finally broken into calm, star-scattered sky, and Roland stood at the edge of the abandoned mill 3 miles east of the city. The location Ignatius's messenger had specified for the exchange, with every nerve drawn tight beneath a composure he'd spent years perfecting. Beside him, cloaked and hooded against recognition, stood not Edmund, but Ferris's youngest recruit, a boy of similar age and build borrowed for the night from a trusted household in the city, his identity concealed carefully enough to survive a distant, torch-lit glance, but not a close inspection. Precisely the deception Roland had gambled everything on. Rosalind waited nearby, concealed among Ferris's men, a short blade tucked into her sleeve despite Roland's initial, reflexive protest against her presence. She had won that argument decisively, reminding him, with a fierceness he'd come to love as much as he'd once feared it, that she had survived considerably more danger alone than tonight was ever likely to demand from either of them together. You're certain about this? She'd asked him earlier that evening, watching him check his sword one final time in the quiet of his study, the real Edmund safely asleep upstairs under Mrs. Abington's watchful guard, entirely unaware of the danger being staged in his name. I'm certain of nothing, Roland had admitted honestly, except that I refuse to let Ignatius Thorne dictate the terms of our family's safety for one moment longer than absolutely necessary. Tonight ends this, one way or another. I would rather face that ending directly than spend one more day waiting for his next move. Then I'm coming with you, she'd said, and he had not, in the end, found it within himself to argue further. Understanding, finally and completely, that partnership meant facing danger together, rather than sparing her from it, out of some misguided instinct toward protection that she had never asked him to provide. Ignatius arrived precisely at midnight, his shoulder bandaged beneath a heavy cloak, 3 armed men trailing behind him despite his obvious weakened state, a man clinging to whatever remaining authority his desperation could still command. You came alone, as instructed, Ignatius observed, though his eyes moved warily across the mill's shadowed edges, searching for the ambush he clearly suspected waited somewhere nearby. How refreshingly obedient, Your Grace, for a man I've watched defy authority his entire life. I came to end this, Roland said, keeping the disguised boy carefully positioned behind him, out of clear sight. One way or another. The document first, Ignatius said. Then the boy. The document is already recovered, Roland said, watching genuine shock crack through Ignatius's careful composure for the first time that night. Your lodge, your ledgers, your entire careful record of 30 years of murder and conspiracy. All of it is in my possession now, Ignatius. You have nothing left to bargain with. Fury and desperation twisted Ignatius's face into something almost unrecognizable from the composed, dignified man Roland had known his entire life. Then you've made a grave error tonight, he snarled, gesturing sharply toward his remaining men. "Because I intend to walk away from this exchange regardless, with or without your cooperation." The ambush Roland had planned sprang the moment Ignatius's men moved. Ferris and a dozen soldiers emerging from the shadows surrounding the mill with practiced, overwhelming speed, cutting off every avenue of retreat before Ignatius's smaller force could mount any meaningful resistance. Two of his men surrendered immediately, weapons clattering against the frozen ground. The third made the fatal mistake of charging toward Roland directly, and was cut down before he'd crossed half the distance between them. Ignatius, cornered and wounded, and finally, fully out of options, turned his remaining fury toward the one target he still believed vulnerable, lunging not toward Roland, but toward the cloaked figure standing behind him, blade drawn in one final, desperate gambit to secure the leverage he'd already lost. Rosalind moved before anyone else could react, stepping directly into his path with a speed that startled even Roland, her own blade rising to meet Ignatius's strike with a precision born of 7 years spent learning, in whatever quiet moments survival allowed her, exactly how to protect what she loved. The confrontation ended almost as quickly as it began. Ignatius's blade knocked wide, Rosalind's own strike finding its mark with controlled, deliberate force, and the man who had stolen 7 years from her family collapsed against the frozen ground, wounded but alive, his final desperate scheme unraveling completely in the space of a few violent seconds. "It's over," Roland said, kneeling beside Ignatius's fallen form as Ferris's men moved to secure him properly this time, chains rather than mere rope, a fortress cell rather than a garrison easily escaped. 30 years, Ignatius. It ends tonight." Ignatius, bleeding and defeated, managed one final bitter laugh. "You think this ends anything?" he rasped. "The document you've recovered still proves what it proves, Your Grace. That boy still carries a claim that could unmake everything your family has built. I may have lost tonight, but the truth I uncovered doesn't simply disappear because you've finally caught me." "No," Roland agreed quietly, rising to his feet, drawing Rosalind close against his side with a protectiveness he made no effort to disguise. "It doesn't disappear, but I intend to face that truth openly, honestly, rather than burying it the way you and my father chose to. That is the difference between us, Ignatius. You spent 30 years believing secrets were the only thing capable of protecting this family. I have learned, this past week, that the truth, however dangerous, is the only foundation worth building anything upon. The revelation of the Ashworth family's buried secrets reached the crown within the week, delivered not through scandal or leaked gossip, but through Roland's own deliberate, carefully considered petition. A full account of his father's conspiracy, Ignatius Thorne's crimes, and the genuine, documented question of Rosalind's bloodline's ancient claim to the dukedom, presented directly to the royal council rather than allowed to fester as rumor and speculation. The council's deliberation lasted 3 tense weeks, weeks during which Roland and Rosalind remained largely secluded at Ashmoor Hall with the children, building the fragile beginnings of a family life neither of them had ever quite dared imagine surviving to see. Edmund grew steadily more confident under Ferris's patient tutelage and swordsmanship. Wren charmed her way through the entire household staff exactly as Rosalind had predicted. Cassius took his first truly steady steps in the estate's garden, Roland's hands hovering nearby with a devotion that made Mrs. Abington's eyes soften every time she witnessed it. The waiting itself proved its own particular trial. Word of the scandal had spread well beyond the capital by then, and Roland received no shortage of correspondence from concerned allies and gleeful rivals alike, each offering their own prediction of how the council might ultimately rule. Some warned him to prepare for the worst, that centuries of precedent rarely favored inconvenient truths over convenient stability, however sympathetic his circumstances might appear. Others assured him the crown would never risk destabilizing a settled dukedom over documentation so many generations removed from present relevance. "Whatever they decide," Rosalind told him one evening, watching him pace the length of his study for what felt like the 100th time that week, "we will face it together. I did not survive 7 years alone, only to lose my composure now, waiting on a council's verdict." "I know," Roland said, though the admission did little to ease the tension coiled in his shoulders. "I simply find I have grown considerably less patient with uncertainty than I once believed myself capable of tolerating. I want our children's future settled, Rosalind. I want to stop waiting for the next threat to emerge from the shadows of my father's mistakes." "Then let us wait together," she said simply, taking his hand and drawing him toward the window, where their children's laughter drifted up from the garden below. Whatever the council decides, that laughter isn't going anywhere. That, at least, is already ours. The council's final ruling, when it arrived, surprised nearly everyone except, perhaps, the Duchess Dowager, whose decades of political acumen had allowed her to anticipate precisely the outcome most likely to satisfy competing royal interests. Rosalind's bloodline claim was formally acknowledged as historically legitimate, but practically unenforceable. Too many generations removed, too thoroughly absorbed into obscurity, to reasonably unseat Roland's own clear and undisputed inheritance. Edmund, as Roland's firstborn son, would inherit the Ashmoor dukedom in the ordinary course of succession, his legitimacy fully and permanently secured, the ancient rival claim formally and publicly laid to rest rather than left to fester as a future threat. More significantly, and more personally, the council extended formal recognition to Roland's petition to marry Rosalind Verne, acknowledging, with unusual grace, that a duke's private grief and a mother's desperate courage deserved rather more sympathy than scandal, particularly once the full extent of the old duke's crimes had been laid bare before them. "You did this," Rosalind said quietly, reading the council's formal ruling in the quiet privacy of Roland's study, disbelief and hope tangled together in her voice. "You faced the crown itself with the truth, rather than hiding any part of it, and they've given us exactly what we never dared hope to ask for." "I faced the crown," Roland said, "because I finally understood that the family I wanted to build couldn't be built on the same foundation of secrets that nearly destroyed us both. You taught me that, Rosalind. Whether you meant to or not, he had proposed to her properly that same evening, in the same rose garden that had witnessed so much of their reunion, dropping to one knee with none of the careful political calculation that had accompanied his engagement to Serilda, and all of the reckless, unguarded devotion he'd once shown a laughing woman covered in mud on a country road. "I have no ring prepared," he admitted, feeling suddenly uncharacteristically nervous despite everything they'd already survived together. "I hadn't intended to ask tonight. I'd planned something considerably more elaborate, befitting a duke's proposal to his duchess. But I find myself unwilling to wait one moment longer than necessary to ask you properly, Rosalind Verne, whether you'll do me the honor of becoming my wife, not out of necessity, not to legitimize what the council has already decided, but because I cannot imagine building the rest of my life with anyone else beside me." Rosalind's laughter, bright and disbelieving, and utterly joyful, rang out across the quiet garden. "You truly believe I require an elaborate ring or a rehearsed speech," she said, drawing him back to his feet, "after everything we've already survived together? Roland, I would have married you 7 years ago in the mud on that road, if you'd asked me properly. I intend to say yes considerably faster now." "Is that a yes, then?" he asked, something boyish and hopeful breaking through his usual composure. "That," she said, closing the distance between them fully at last, "is most emphatically a yes." The formal announcement of Duke Roland Ashworth's engagement to Rosalind Verne, no longer merely tolerated but genuinely celebrated by a public captivated by the full, dramatic story of their reunion, sent ripples of delighted scandal through every drawing room in the capital, considerably more forgiving in its final telling than the whispered condemnation that had first greeted 3 children bursting into a ballroom weeks earlier. Lady Serilda Cromwell, to her considerable credit, sent a formal letter of genuine congratulations, along with a small, thoughtfully chosen gift for each of the 3 children. A gesture of grace that Roland suspected owed more to her own character than to her father's diminished political standing, and one that Rosalind, upon reading it, insisted they respond to with an invitation to the wedding itself. "She deserves better than to be remembered simply as the broken engagement," Rosalind said, and Roland, watching her extend genuine kindness toward a woman who might easily have remained a rival in a lesser heart, felt his love for her deepen in ways he hadn't believed still possible after everything they'd already survived together. Lord Cromwell himself retreated from court entirely within the month, his political influence considerably diminished by the full revelation of his complicity, though Roland, true to his word, ensured the worst of the scandal settled on Cromwell's own shoulders rather than spreading to touch Serilda's future prospects. Rosalind observed quietly, precisely the kind of mercy her own 7 years of hiding had taught her to value above almost anything else. Ignatius Thorne stood trial before the Royal Council 2 months later, the full weight of 30 years of conspiracy laid bare in testimony that shocked even nobility long accustomed to scandal. He was stripped of his titles, his considerable fortune seized to compensate the families of the 3 workhouse victims whose bodies had been stolen to fabricate Rosalind's death, and sentenced to permanent exile from the kingdom's borders. A fate he received with the same bitter, unrepentant defiance he'd shown at the mill, insisting even then that everything he'd done had been in service of protecting a family that, in the end, wanted no part of the protection he'd offered them. The recovery of Physician Hale's remains from the location noted in his own hidden journal brought its own quiet, difficult closure. A proper burial finally granted to a man who had, in his final months, apparently wrestled with the weight of his own complicity before Ignatius silenced him permanently. Roland personally funded a modest headstone, engraved simply with the physician's name and the years of his birth and death, a small act of restored dignity for a man whose conscience, however belatedly, had ultimately cost him his life. The 3 workhouse victims proved harder to identify with certainty, their names lost to the particular anonymity poverty so often imposes even in death, but Roland commissioned a memorial stone regardless, placed in the churchyard nearest the estate, inscribed with words he'd chosen himself. To 3 souls stolen even in death, that a lie might live. May they finally rest, named or unnamed, in whatever peace this world failed to grant them in life. Rosalind visited the memorial often in the months that followed, always bringing fresh flowers, always pausing for a long, quiet moment of reflection before returning to the living, breathing family she'd fought so hard to protect. "Do you feel triumphant?" Rosalind asked Roland quietly, the evening after the verdict was delivered, both of them standing once more in the rose garden that had witnessed so much of their reunion's most pivotal moments. Roland considered the question with the gravity it deserved. "No," he finally admitted. "I feel relieved. Triumph implies some kind of victory worth celebrating, and I find I have very little interest in celebrating anything built on the graves of 3 innocent people who never asked to be part of this conspiracy at all. I simply feel grateful, Rosalind, that it's finally, truly over, and that we survived long enough to build something better from the wreckage." The wedding took place on a bright spring morning in the same rose garden where Roland had first held Rosalind again after 7 years of believing her lost forever. The roses now in full, riotous bloom around a small, intimate gathering of the people who mattered most to both of them. Mrs. Abington weeping openly with joy throughout the entire ceremony, Ferris standing proudly at Roland's side as his chosen witness, the Duchess Dowager watching from a chair positioned carefully in the garden's warmest patch of sunlight, her weakened frame, unable to stand for the full ceremony but her presence, and her evident joy, unmistakable nonetheless. Edmund walked his mother down the garden's central path, solemn and proud in equal measure, a role he'd requested for himself with a seriousness that had made both his parents' hearts ache with tenderness. Wren scattered rose petals with theatrical enthusiasm along the entire route, delighting the small gathered crowd. Cassius, perched happily in Mrs. Abington's arms, clapped his small hands together every time anyone else in the garden laughed, entirely unbothered by his own lack of understanding regarding the ceremony's significance. Rosalind wore a simple gown of pale blue silk, the same shade, Roland noted with quiet, private emotion, as the fabric that had once, 7 years ago, been mistakenly identified as belonging to her supposed remains. A deliberate choice she'd made herself, reclaiming the color from the grief it had once represented and remaking it into something joyful instead. "You look," Roland said softly, when she finally reached him at the garden's center, "exactly the way you looked laughing in the mud on that road 7 years ago. As though the whole world simply hasn't managed to touch you yet." "The whole world touched me plenty," she said, smiling through tears she made no effort to hide. "I simply refused to let it keep me from this moment, whatever it cost me to reach it." They exchanged vows beneath an arch of climbing roses, promises spoken plainly and without the elaborate formality either of their positions might have demanded, a private choice, deliberately made. To build their marriage on the same foundation of honesty Roland had insisted upon before the crown itself. "I promise," Roland said, holding both her hands steady in his voice carrying clearly across the small, hushed gathering, "to never again mistake silence for protection, to choose honesty with you, even when honesty is difficult, for as long as we both shall live. And I promise to love you exactly as fiercely as I did on that muddy road 7 years ago, without reservation, without condition, and without ever again allowing duty to convince me that love is a luxury I cannot afford." "I promise," Rosalind answered, tears bright in her eyes though her voice remained steady, "to never again choose isolation over trust, however frightened I might become. I promise to raise our children in the light rather than in hiding, to teach them that courage means facing truth together rather than burying it alone. And I promise to love you, Roland Ashworth, for every day you have left to give me, grateful, every single one of them, that we found our way back to each other despite everything that tried to keep us apart." When Roland finally, properly kissed his bride before the small, joyful crowd of witnesses, 7 years of grief and longing dissolved entirely into a happiness neither of them had quite dared believe themselves capable of reclaiming. Edmund whooped with unrestrained delight beside them, quickly joined by Wren's delighted clapping, and even Cassius, sensing the joy around him without fully understanding its cause, added his own enthusiastic squeal to the celebration. Mrs. Abington wept through the entire reception that followed, insisting between happy tears that she had never in 30 years of service witnessed a happier occasion at Ashmoor Hall, and the Duchess Dowager, from her seat of honor in the warm evening sun, watched her grandson dance his new bride across the garden with an expression of quiet, hard-won peace that spoke more eloquently than any words could have of a woman finally seeing a wrong she had failed to prevent made right at last. Autumn arrived at Ashmoor Hall 3 years later, to find the estate transformed in ways that went considerably deeper than the changing season. Edmund, now 10, already showing the makings of a thoughtful, principled future duke under his father's patient guidance. Wren, 9, having charmed her way into becoming the estate's unofficial ambassador to every visiting dignitary's children. Cassius, 6, trailing after his older siblings with the fierce, uncomplicated devotion of a boy who had never known his family as anything other than whole and safe. A 4th child had joined them the previous spring, a daughter, named Ismelda, after the grandmother who had lived just long enough to hold her before passing peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by the family whose survival she'd helped secure through her own quiet courage in finally telling the truth. Edmund had taken in recent months to ask his father careful, thoughtful questions about the responsibilities that would one day fall to him. Questions about fairness, about the proper use of power, about how a duke ought to treat those with considerably less standing than himself. Roland answered each question with the same patient honesty he'd promised Rosalind at their wedding, understanding that the boy who had once walked fearlessly into a ballroom to claim a father he'd never met was growing into precisely the kind of man capable of ensuring his family's past mistakes were never repeated. "Grandmother's memorial garden needs new roses," Edmund announced one afternoon, finding his parents together in the study where so much of the family's difficult history had first come to light. "The old ones are looking tired. I thought we might plant something new, something that means new beginnings, the way Mama's blue dress did at the wedding." "That," Roland said, exchanging a warm, private glance with Rosalind over their son's earnest, thoughtful face, "sounds like precisely the sort of decision a good duke would make." Rosalind stood at the edge of the same rose garden one evening not long after, watching her children chase each other through the last golden light of the day, and felt Roland's arms come around her from behind, his chin resting gently against the top of her head in a gesture that had become, over 3 years of marriage, as familiar and comforting as breathing. "Do you ever think about how close we came to losing all of this?" she asked quietly, watching Edmund lift his youngest sister onto his shoulders with the same protective tenderness he'd shown his siblings since the night he'd first walked into a ballroom and called a stranger father. "Every day," Roland admitted. "And every day I find myself grateful beyond words that you were brave enough to send them to find me, even after everything you'd survived, to keep them hidden." "I nearly didn't," Rosalind said softly. "I spent 3 years terrified that reaching out would cost us everything. In the end, it was the only choice that ever could have saved us." "Then I suppose," Roland said, pressing a kiss into her hair, "we owe everything we have now to your courage rather than mine." "We owe it to both of us," she corrected gently, turning in his arms to face him fully, 7 years of grief and 3 years of hard-won happiness written plainly across both their faces. "To choose honesty over hiding, to choose each other over and over again, even when the whole world seemed determined to keep us apart." The children's laughter carried across the garden as the sun finally set behind Ashmoor Hall's ancient stone walls, and Duke Roland Ashworth, once a man who had believed himself incapable of feeling anything beyond duty and careful, guarded grief, understood with quiet, complete certainty that he had finally, truly come home. Not to a title, or an estate, or any of the careful architecture he'd once believed defined him, but to the family he had never stopped hoping, against all reasonable evidence, that he might someday find his way back to. If Roland and Rosalind's journey from grief and separation to love reclaimed against impossible odds moved you, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment sharing which moment touched you most, and subscribe to the Royal Duke Diaries for more stories of royal romance, hidden truths, and love that refuses to stay buried, no matter how the world conspires against it. Their story reminds us of something worth carrying beyond the palace walls and rose gardens of this tale. That courage often looks like a mother teaching her children to be brave alone in the dark. That love worth having is built on honesty rather than convenient silence, and that even when the truth costs us everything we thought we needed to protect, it is almost always the only foundation strong enough to build a real and lasting happiness upon. Wherever you are carrying a truth you're afraid to speak, may you find, as Roland and Rosalind did, that the people who truly love you were only ever waiting for the chance to stand beside you once you finally let them see it. Thank you for spending this story with us. We'll see you in the next one.